Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Trump calls on other nations to help secure the Strait of Hormuz from Time.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't really think the U.S. should have gotten involved in the quagmire in Iran in the first place. But now that they're involved, now that it looks like they need help securing the Strait of Hormuz. And yeah, personally, I think that the libertarian positions, shouldn't have got involved in the first place. But ultimately, I think since we are involved, we should probably be trying to do it as much as far as ourselves as possible. And I don't know if we should be asking other nations for help. We already have the largest navy in the world, so that's my thoughts there. If other nations do want to help out, I think they should be fine. But I don't think that they should be forced to help if they don't feel like it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have capitalists attacking socialism by describing capitalism, posted by Ragnar OKXD, and that's a tweet from, looks like some guy, the name is blurred out, who tweeted, "Yeah, the cyberpunk genre shows how bad socialism, the greedy rich elite class, which all support left-leaning politics, and globalism is. The cyberpunk message is that government control is bad, and the left wants more government control. Cyberpunk is anti-leftist by nature." And yeah, personally, I never played any of the Cyberpunk games, but, ultimately, when it comes to a lot of media, people are all obviously gonna try and spin it so it fits their agenda, regardless of what it is, if it's a video game, a television show, a movie, anything, it's ultimately people are going to try to spin it to fit their agenda as much as possible, and yeah, personally, if you want to think that the game's anti-leftist by nature, I think that's fine. But if you want to think it's anti-rightist by nature, that's fine too. Ultimately, people are going to come to different conclusions based off the same work a lot of the time, and that's important to note. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the people who are winning wars have to constantly declare victory every day, posted by Acadian Academic, and that looks like a Trump Wojak who's crying and soy faced as the kids these days say, holding up his phone with a large wall of text on Truth Social saying, I guess he's declaring victory or something. I don't know. It's quite the large wall of text. And yeah, personally, if Trump wants to declare victory every day, I think that's fine. But, it seems like he didn't learn the lessons of the Iraq War on the campaign trail. He was constantly going over the lessons of he was going over constantly, saying, oh, we need to learn the lessons of the Iraq War. We can't have boots on the ground and be in forever wars forever. And now it looks like, he's getting the U.S. into his own forever war. And that just goes to show you that, ultimately, politicians will say one thing on the campaign trail and then do the opposite when they get in. Honest politician is very much an oxymoron a lot of the time. You do have a few good politicians like Thomas Massie or Rand Paul, but they are very much the exception rather than the rule. Next, we have Remembering Brian Doherty, chronicler of and participant in wild and wonderful subcultures from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, if people want to remember anyone for any reason, I think they should be able to. Ultimately, I never really heard about this guy but if you want to support him and celebrate his life, I think you should be able to. Same with anyone else. With that being said, if you want to celebrate the life of someone like Joseph Stalin, I think that's kind of anti-libertarian. But ultimately, celebrate whatever you feel like. That's very much the libertarian position. Next, we have everything about the U.S.-Israel war on Iran is being absolutely censored, blocked, and taken down, posted by Acadian Academic, and they added, Trump threatens media of treason for reporting and not towing the line that dear leader's war has been a massive success and victory has been declared 20 times. What's the difference between us and Russia or North Korea at this point? And yeah, personally, I think this is a bit hyperbolic. You can find tons of stuff on the U.S.-Israel war on Iran, but ultimately, sometimes if people don't like it, they might try and censor it. It's like Trump's trying to do, but ultimately, I think it's interesting how Reddit, it suddenly cares about censorship, even though they've been on the other end of the censorship spectrum for years, saying, "Oh, we gotta ban hate speech and misinformation," and it's even this subreddit, which claims to be uncensored and which I used to moderate, has banned me for almost 2 years now, and that just goes to show a lot of people claim to be against censorship, but they'll support it if it fits their agenda. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump wants to cover up bad news about the Iran war, posted from Reason.com, posted by Johnny Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think, libertarian position is, you should have as free media as possible to discuss whatever you want, including the Iran war. With that, and, ultimately, if it's not going well for you, that sometimes you just have to cope with it. Maybe you shouldn't have gotten involved in the first place. But, regardless, I would say that, a lot of people are saying, well, Trump censoring too much on the Iran war would be all for the government censorship about the Iran war if Kamala was the one in charge currently. Most people don't have any values or principles. They only have teams. The left has constantly been pushing for censorship for years, but when Donald Trump says we need to censor something, suddenly censorship is the worst thing ever, and it just goes to show you, no principles, only teams. Next, we have a Belgian wealth manager explains why it thinks the U.S. Treasuries aren't a sustainable bet from Bloomberg.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I think that the U.S. is supposed to be economically collapsed any day now for the past forever at this point, but I don't know how likely that is. Ultimately, I think if you want to invest in U.S. government treasuries, I think you should be able to. They might collapse, but ultimately, I do think they're probably one of the better bets in the world because of how big the U.S. economy and is on the global scale. But ultimately, it could collapse at any second. But I've been pretty much told that for my entire life, and you have had some problems like at the 2008 financial crash and all that. But ultimately, I think it's just going to keep on keeping on until maybe it doesn't anymore. And that's very much how nothing ever does seem to happen, especially when social media is like the world's ending every day, but nothing ever really does seem to happen. People will cope and life will move on regardless of how good or bad the economy is, I would say. Next, we have Not Our War. U.S. allies balk at Trump's Strait of Hormuz demands from NBCNews.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, it was a bit rich for Trump to be asking from countries he had previously insulted. Former Estonian it was Richard Trump asking help from foreign countries he previously insulted. Former Estonian President Toomas Hendrik Ives told NBC News in a telephone interview. And I would agree with that. You shouldn't be insulting other countries and then demand that they help you. Ultimately, I think the U.S. should try and sell this on its own. If they want to sell sprout for other countries, I think that's fine. But it's by no means entitled to help from other countries. Next, we have Trump Presidential Library Fund, paid by company CSU, has dissolved with no paid public accounting. Posted from ibatimes.co.uk, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross post from the LOL subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think that, if Trump wants to dissolve his library fund paid by companies he sued, he should be able to. I would like if there was public accounting, but, a lot of times the government isn't going to be very transparent. Reddit constantly says, oh, Trump's not transparent, but, they constantly made excuses for when Biden wasn't transparent. And I would say that Trump's definitely more transparent than Biden, but you couldn't get away with saying that on Reddit without being downvoted or censored. So it just goes to show you, Reddit's very much an echo chamber that, if someone has an R next to their name, they'll try and attack them as much as possible in everything they do. But ultimately, if they have the D next to their name and do the same shit, they'll always make excuses and downplay it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Check Out the Crowd. Thomas Massey drew in Harrison County, Kentucky over the weekend, posted by Noam Sane, and that's a picture of, Thomas Massey speaking at a bar in Harrison County, Kentucky. It looks like there's not too many people there. And yeah, personally, if you want to go after Thomas Massey and say his crowds are small, I think that's fine. The left's been going after Donald Trump's crowd size for forever, but it doesn't matter what your crowd size is. It matters who shows up to vote, and that's ultimately what matters. You can always go for cheap blows like, oh, he's not drawing a big crowd, but it doesn't really matter how big a crowd you draw. It matters how good your ideas are. The Libertarian Party doesn't usually get too many above 5% in the presidential elections, but I would say they should probably win every presidential election. And it just goes to show you, just because a lot of people support one thing, that doesn't make it right. I remember, I think Cheyenne Woodley said in an interview, Hitler had millions of followers, Jesus had 12. I think that's important to remember as well. Just because the majority believes something doesn't necessarily make it right. It's a great argument against democracy, because democracy is simply mob rule and tyranny of the majority. And libertarians are all about individualism and individual rights, and I would say democracy is kind of inherently contradictory to that. And no, regardless, I still do think Thomas Massie will probably win his primary over Ed Galbraith. But if he doesn't, I'll just add fuel to my fire that democracy is inherently anti-liberty. Next, we have Trump vows to bomb Iranian island a few more times just for fun from themirror.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross post from the military subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think Trump should be bombing anywhere, but ultimately the U.S. government's going to be bombing wherever it wants to bomb, and ultimately there's nothing you can do about it. Usually it's in the Middle East, but sometimes it's outside the Middle East, like it was in Venezuela recently, a few months ago. I think that's important to remember as well. And yeah, personally, I do think, that the U.S. government can justify bombing the island as many times as it wants. But, Reddit only cares because the out group's in power rather than the in group. If Kamala was bombing that island as much as she wanted, Reddit would say, oh, she's just trying to send a message to anti-LGBTQ, whatever other layers they've had as well, Iran. And it just goes to show you, no principles, only teams. If this was a Democrat war in Iran, Reddit would love it, but since it's a Republican war, Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever. It's very much how, they loved the war in Ukraine under Biden. They loved, they were kind of critical of all Biden's Israel shit, though. I'll give them that. But, ultimately, they'll love war if it's marketed the correct way. Just look at how they wanted to send infinite money and weapons to Ukraine. They just care about what the narrative is. I'm sure if the narrative was that the Iran war was the best thing ever, they'd love it. But since it's Orange Man bad and anything Orange Man supports bad, suddenly they have to be against it. Next, we have Law Passed That Threatens Our Privacy, posted by Inferno Warrior 299, and that's a cross post from the Actual Conservatism subreddit, and that's a YouTube video from Loyal Moses, who your phone is now required to spy on you. It's the law. And yeah, personally, I don't think your phone should be spying on you. But ultimately, people are going to spy on you however they feel like, and that's ultimately how the world works a lot of the time. I remember the NSA spying revelations that the NSA federal government agency was spying on U.S. citizens, which were over a decade ago now, back in 2013, and it's probably only gotten worse since then. I would be surprised if at least 5 U.S. government agencies, 5 foreign government agencies, and 5 private companies were spying you at any given moment, and that's just probably conservative estimate too. It's probably countless at this point. And that's my thoughts there. Ultimately, I don't really care. Think anyone should be spying on you without your consent. But ultimately, sometimes, you can't always get what you want. Some people are going to spy on you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And next, and I was supposed to want to share from the Libertarian Party USA subreddit that I made too. I said, libertarian perspectives on finding common ground. I said, with Trump embroiled in a pointless war in the Middle East and on Israel's behalf, and the political right as a whole increasingly going after libertarians. And I linked to an article from Reason.com about how the post-Charlie Kirk right is at war with itself, and libertarians are the odd target. It seems like the political left should be upping its outreach to as many libertarians as possible. This could be further from the truth, though, especially when you look at Reddit. I was scrolling through the front page of the app a few days ago when I happened on this comic by Pizza Cake, who is very much a left-wing strawman, to be fair, but then again, it's par for the course when it comes to normie Reddit, that says that you shouldn't try to find common ground with anyone you can disagree with, and to stick to your online echo chambers as much as possible. It's a problem that Reddit increasingly has. You can't dissent from whatever the official woke narrative is at all without them coming after you for it. You could be the one of the frontrunners for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination in 2028, and they will still go after you if you dare step out of line. And I linked to an article from the Full Moss subreddit. California Governor Gavin Newsom, no doubt that the Democratic Party needs to be, dare I say, more culturally normal. I believe that less prone spending disproportionate amounts of time on pronouns and identity politics, more focused on tabletop issues, things that really matter. And yeah, personally, and they went after him for saying that. And I said, if you want to alienate as many people as possible, in the period, that's fine. That's whatever you want to. Don't be surprised if people don't show up to vote for your political party as a result. For all his faults, Trump has at least shown that he's willing to outreach to members of groups that do outreach to members of groups that might not really support him, which is why he won in the last presidential election. And it looks like Reddit still hasn't learned that lesson. Thoughts? And yeah, personally, if you want to be constantly bitch at people who don't fulfill your notions of ideological purity, that's fine. But ultimately, when you constantly call people racist, white supremacist, Hitler, Nazi, fascist, etc., for dissenting from your worldview in any way at all. Ultimately, don't be surprised when you don't start without winning elections. Cat of Gray, some replied to me. This was posted with a huge wall of text, and I said, constantly trying to lecture anyone who dissents from you in any way whatsoever is the exact reason that the left has become so unpopular. Learn your lesson already, please. The left has a great feel right now to do a lot of outreach to a lot of disaffected right-wing MAGA people, but it won't do that. It will just continue to woke scold them for any dissent whatsoever from the official DNC woke narrative, and that's why increasingly, they'll probably keep losing elections for the foreseeable future. If they win, only because the media is going orange man bad constantly. If they do take back the presidency in 2028, I definitely do think they'll probably lose it in 2032 because they won't change. The only reason they're doing so well right now to begin with is because the TV's just saying Orange Man bad constantly, and the Orange Man's making a lot of stupid decisions like going to war with Iran and all the tariffs and all that. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter because they're all the same uniparty anyway. It's all politics is mostly just theater, and as long as the uniparty wins, ultimately, people are just gonna keep on keeping on. I saw a good beam on Twitter a while ago. It's like Tom can't kill Jerry. If Tom ever gets Jerry, the show is over. And then what happens next? That's very much how the Republicans and the Democrats work. They're constantly at each other's throats, but none of them can ever permanently win forever because then the show's over. And ultimately they don't really have any plans for after the show. So that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we are gonna wrap it up there. See if there's anything new on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. It looks like there is not. I don't think so. Yeah. So we're gonna wrap it there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.